At our best, America has led. We have led by our example as a shining city on a hill. We have led by giving voice to the voiceless.
At some point in this new century, we lost track of our national values.
But they're more partisan, more tribal, more of the time than at any time that I can remember. We've all played some role in it.
More than 4 in 5 American adults believe the future of American democracy is under serious threat.
We've seen an assault on our democracy like we've never seen.
We're coming after you. You will be served lead.
From attacks on everyday Americans at the forefront of protecting democracy to the erosion of trust in our institutions.
Democracies don't fight each other.
When tribalism takes over a political system, that becomes very dangerous because you start to see everything through your group's lens.
I was grabbed, beaten, tased, all while being called a traitor to my country.
These are such hard conversations that we shouldn't be having to have.
John McCain would say that we can't give up on working together.
We have a moral obligation to continue in our just cause, and we would bring more than shame on ourselves if we don't.
Reconciliation is not easy.
These are extraordinary times, and we face an extraordinary challenge.
Freedom itself is dependent on the strength and vitality of our national character.
But this is not just an issue for us here in the United States. This is an issue for nascent democracies around the world.
But freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction.
Courage, leadership, character.
Preserve, protect, and defend
the Constitution of the United States.
So help me God.
Empathy.
By understanding that we may have different stories, but we hold common hopes.
Beyond politics, the McCain Institute's Defending American Democracy virtual event series will cultivate those forward-seeking conversations. Transcend politics. Move forward together, rebuilding our city on a hill.
Do not despair of our present difficulties. We believe always in the promise and greatness of America. Americans never quit. We never surrender. We never hide from history. We make history.
First of all, welcome to the McCain Institute's inaugural Defending American Democracy conversation series. We're going to be more pleased to have everyone here today. We've embarked on this project to carry on the legacy, of course, of Senator John McCain. He knew that together as Americans, we can find common ground to solve most of our pressing issues together. We also see that Americans' faith in democracy is waning these days. As we've seen in recent polls from NPR Ipsos that was taken late last year, 64% of Americans believe democracy is in crisis, and more than 70%, about 70% of Americans, regardless of political background, Democrat, Republican, Independent, believe that our country is in crisis and risk of failing, which is tremendously concerning to many of us. At the McCain Institute, we want to strengthen and defend American democracy, bringing together various voices on issues that are at the core of our democracy. So we're pleased that our first conversation today is on the issue of local journalism and what the loss of local journalism is having on the impact on our own American democracy. Just want to give a little bit of background, and I'm going to steal some information from one of our panelists' organizations. So the University of North Carolina's Hussman School of Journalism and Media report that they published recently in the past year or two, more in the past 15 years, at least 1,800 newspapers have closed. That's about a quarter of the United States newspapers around the country. The pandemic has exacerbated this loss, which also, local news, publications translates national issues into local issues. As our panelist, Representative Novak would know, he's from a small town in Wisconsin. How did those issues in Washington translate to Southern Wisconsin? And part of this report is also advocating for new models to save and grow local media. And our lead moderator here, Steve Waldman from Report for America, can talk about what they're doing in that area, but also From a legislative perspective, Representative Novak can talk about some of the issues that he's bringing up to find legislative fixes and at the local level. So, you know, one of the other concerns we have is just Americans' trust in media overall. It's good for local media, but it's not so looking good for national media. As we've seen, you know, across the political spectrum, Republicans, support local media at 66%, Democrats, 84%. National news trust in national news is lower, 50% nationally. But when you delve down, 78% of Democrats and 35% of Republicans support national news media, which is troubling, no matter what part of the political spectrum you come from. Which again brings us to the topic of today, which is, is the loss of local journalism endangering American democracy? As we mentioned, more than close to 2,000 news outlets have closed around the country, which is really troubling. But we're really, on the flip side, we're excited to start this conversation, especially with our panelists today, which each of them come from various backgrounds, but all have been journalists around the country. Our lead moderator, Steve Waldman, he's the president and founder of Report for America. Also was the national editor of U.S. News and World Reports and a correspondent for Newsweek. We also have Emily Woodruff. She's a Report for America Corps member, and she's at the Times-Picayune and the New Orleans Advocate, based in Louisiana, of course. Next, we have Erica Beshears Perel. Did I pronounce that correctly? Yes, I want to make sure. She's the director of the University of North Carolina's Center for Innovation and Sustainability in Local Media, which is part of the Hussman School of Journalism and Media. She's a former, I believe, editor of the Daily Tar Heel, which is the University of North Carolina's student newspaper, as well as worked as a reporter for the Charlotte Observer. And finally, we have Representative Todd Novak. He represents the 51st Assembly District in Wisconsin. He's concurrently the mayor of Dodgeville, Wisconsin, and also worked for a local newspaper, the Dodgeville Chronicle. So welcome to all of you. Welcome to our audience. We're really excited to start this conversation series, which we had help from the Knight Foundation to get this off the ground. So really appreciate the support that we're getting from our funder there. So Steve, I'm going to hand it over to you to start this conversation, and then we'll hear from the audience at close to 12:55.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Paul, and to McCain Institute. I think it is significant that the McCain Institute is having this conversation, because the question is one that all Americans, regardless of party, should be focused on. The quest to help save local news should not be a kind of partisan or ideological one. In addition to the statistics that Paul mentioned, 1,800 communities have no local news or no local newspaper right now. And to me, the other statistic that is sort of chilling to me is there's been about a 57% drop in the number of reporters since 2004. I mean, just think about that. We think about the battered steel industry that we all know has taken a total beating. They've lost about 15% of their employees during that time, just to give you a sense of perspective. And it's really important that we understand most of that is in local. That we're not talking about a crisis in the media. We're talking about a crisis in local news. The economics are very different. And in fact, when you talk to people, regular people about this, and you say there's problems in local news, I often end up getting a kind of confused look. I'm like, what are you talking about? I'm deluged with information. There's information everywhere. I've got news everywhere. I've got news coming into me from every possible outlet. And that's true. So that is existing simultaneously with a collapse in local reporting. And it's just important for us to make that distinction. And does it affect democracy? Very much so. I think there's now all sorts of academic studies that show that when you have less local news, you have less voter turnout, less engagement with the community, less civic volunteering. You have more corruption, more pollution even, lower bond ratings. There's been studies showing that having less local news even leads to lower bond ratings and higher taxes. Just basically makes it hard for a community to solve their own problems. And more recently, we're also have, I think, all become aware of the idea that having less local news also erodes the health of a community in a more spiritual way, in a way, like people knowing each other less well and polarization being greater, misinformation, just the role that local news at its best, and we don't want to, glorify local news beyond the reality, but at its best, help provide cohesion to a community and identity and helping people to understand each other. So I do think that the collapse of local news is connected to the rise in polarization. I don't know that it's the cause, but I think it's certainly a really important solution. Now, we are trying to address that in two ways. One is Report for America, which, if you haven't heard of it, is a national service program, loosely modeled on Teach for America, AmeriCorps, places like that, City Year, that places amazing journalists like Emily Woodruff into local newsrooms that have a demonstrated gap, where that have identified there's some important issue or community that's not getting covered. We recruit them from all over the country, and then we pay half the salary in the first year, and then we work with the newsrooms to raise the other half, and in a lot of cases to make this a sustainable position. So Report for America now has it's about to have 325 reporters in the field in June. It's about 300 now, or a little under. And then the other thing that we've been working on is we pulled together something called the Rebuild Local News Coalition, which is a coalition of 17 national organizations advocating stronger local news and public policy that might help with that. Our big emphasis in this past year was something called the Local Journalism Sustainability Act, which provided would provide tax credits for small businesses to support local news through advertising, subscribers to buy subscriptions, and payroll tax credit. And we got quite far with that, actually. It was in Build Back Better, a portion of it was, and there's a chance that it may reemerge in some other form. So let me just stop there. The short answer to the question is the decline in local news endangering democracy? Is definitely yes. But why don't I stop there and turn to this great panel to elaborate. So I think we're going to start first with Erica from UNC.
Thank you, Steve. And thanks very much to the McCain Institute for having me on this panel today and introducing this important topic. A little bit about my background. I have been a local reporter, mostly for the Charlotte Observer, and then I've been deeply immersed in student media, including being publisher of an independent nonprofit student media company. So I kind of know what it means to be in the trenches, trying to make payroll, trying to juggle bills and sell ads and fundraise all at the same time, while also working with student journalists on what they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. Also have been pretty deeply immersed in the world of local news transformation, specifically through the program known as Table Stakes. Here at the Hussman School of Journalism and Media and our center, our center's challenge is to help build a more sustainable and equitable future for local news organizations, also the communities that they serve and the journalists who work there. And we do that through the intersection of research, education, and outreach. We run a regional newsroom transformation program that serves Southeastern news organizations and journalists. And our research, including the News Deserts research cited earlier, aims to answer some of the big challenges and big questions facing local news. And I think critically, we really want to ask and answer the question of what does it mean to be sustainable in the context of local news? How can that be measured, predicted? How might it be different across geographies or demographics? What it means for communities and journalists. As has been said, the link between high quality local news and a well-functioning democracy is clear, but the answer to kind of what ails local news right now is less clear. Overall, the picture is worrisome, and I'm interested in kind of digging in with this panel about that. But I will say that I'm heartened by a couple of things. I'm very heartened when I talk to the journalists and leaders on the ground at local news organizations that we work with through our center. They're highly committed. They're hardworking. They believe in collaboration. They believe in kind of the news ecosystem approach to news, in meeting communities where they are, and in reaching communities that have never been well served by local news. So that's just very heartening. And I think the other thing is, the same thing goes for the journalism students that I work with at UNC. It's impossible to be cynical about the future of news when I'm with those folks.
Thank you, Erica. Representative Novak.
Well, first of all, thank you. Thank you for the invite. I'm glad to be here. Just a little bit about my background. I'm the mayor of the city of Dodgeville, as you noted, and state representative in the 51st Assembly District. Prior to my career in politics, which I never really planned on getting into, I was editor of the Dodgeville Chronicle in Dodgeville, Wisconsin for 25 years until I resigned after I got elected. I am not as old as I probably look or have been in the system. I started at the newspaper when I was 22, so just so you know. But my forte was covering government in depth, local county board, city councils, school boards, court systems. So I was very integrated into that aspect of everything. And I kind of fell into this. Dodgeville had a mayor who was 20, he'd been in office 20 years, he wasn't going to run again, and there's some issues in the city. And one day some business people invited me to have breakfast, and they asked me to run for mayor. And I'm like, well, why do you want me running for mayor? And they said, Todd, you've been at every city council meeting for 20 years. If anybody can step in, So I was elected in 2012, and then an open assembly seat came open in 2014. Part of my job in the state assembly, I'm very fortunate. I've been there 4 terms. I'm chairman of local government committee, which is where any aspect of newspapers goes to if there's going to be legislation. In Wisconsin, we have a very robust public notice law. And we've been, every year I have to fight off changes in government notices. The school districts and municipalities do not like publishing in newspapers. They believe the internet's the way to go. I believe public notices is a very important aspect. I'm a very rural district. I'm one of the most ag diverse districts in the state. And I have 8 weekly newspapers in my assembly district that cover this area. I have 2 daily newspapers, not in my district, but close enough by that they cover my area. With that said, my problem is where my angle in the assembly is I have many legislators that have no newspapers. And so they don't really have a stake in media. And then also Wisconsin has gone through, as many states, a big purge, not a purge, buyouts, consolidations. I know one of my state newspapers, Wisconsin State Journal, is owned by Lee, is under assault right now by a hedge fund. So my job is not only to stop, as chair of local government, any bills to mess around with public notices, but to just inform my colleagues how important the media is to everybody that doesn't have a media presence in their area. And I go back to when I started the newspaper. We had a fax, that was it. That's where you got your stuff, no internet, dark room where you developed film and all that. So, I mean, I've watched the progression through my years at the paper of the changes. So I think it's just important, very important. You know, like I said, I think one of the reasons I have so many weeklies, I have a large senior population. I'm firmly convinced, and I tell this to everybody, seniors are not internet. They like to touch the paper. They like to read the paper. And I think that's why a lot of mine newspapers have been able to survive all over. They have consolidated. I only have one independent weekly or two independent weeklies left. The rest are owned by one corporation. So it's kind of a 30,000 feet overview of me, I guess.
Thank you. And I know we're going to want to come back and talk about the legislation. But before we do that, I'm very, very pleased to call on Emily Woodruff. I have to say, we're like at Report for America incredibly proud of Emily and the work that she's done in Louisiana.
Well, thank you, and thanks for having me here. It's really nice to see you all and to hear about this support for local news. So I'm Emily Woodruff. I'm a health reporter in New Orleans, and I'm the only dedicated local health reporter working in print in the entire state of Louisiana. People are sort of always surprised to hear this. It surprises me too, honestly, even after 3 years of being here, because there's really nowhere where health reporting could be used more. We are a state that is at the bottom of nearly every measurable health metric that you could find. And I don't just mean things like, you know, cancer or heart disease, but also social determinants of health, like poverty, access to healthy food, or, you know, the level of domestic violence. So I've written about all of these things. It's, you know, I feel like I've written about like every single subject. But you know, all that said, Louisiana is a very special place, and it's been a great place to report in, because the people here just like invite you inside their homes. They'll talk to you on their porches. You know, I can get so many facts about someone in like 15 minutes of talking to them. It's sort of an amazing place to live. I got here in June 2019 through Report for America. And so for me, because you know, the health reporting beat was considered this news desert, that meant that I was building a beat. You know, no one was, you know, and I want to be clear, my colleagues were covering health before this, but no one was dedicated to it. And so a lot of times that means institutions are like taken aback by you covering them closely, because no one has been doing it for a little while. So I wrote, you know, I did that for about 7 months. And then my first story about COVID was in January 2020. And by March 2020, that's pretty much what I write about all the time. Louisiana has been hit very hard by COVID. We are coming off of our 5th wave. So that's mainly what my job is now. In the lulls, I kind of get back to other things. It's usually through the lens of COVID. And as devastating as all of those things have been, you know, through hurricanes that have hit the state, it really has just been an honor to be that person who brings news to people in this important time. So thanks for having me.
Hey, Emily, I wanted to start with you just while it's fresh. So what are just some examples of the kinds of stories that you think have been important for you to have done, or that you got reaction from, to help? You know, it's always hard to kind of prove a negative. We talk about a news desert and there's nothing there and people kind of don't know what they're missing. So give a sense of, you know, what the people of Louisiana would be missing if you weren't there covering this beat. What are just some stories you've done that you feel were important?
I think when newsrooms or reporters are stretched thin, and you're a daily newspaper and you have a pressure to produce every day, what goes reported is often things from elected officials or, you know, people who are used to talking to the news. people who expect a reporter to come to them. And so I think by me being here, I'm covering people who have never spoken to the news before, just regular people who have never talked to a journalist. And they're people who live down my street or, you know, in the next neighborhood. And they're always kind of like, you're with the news, like taken aback by me. And so I think those kind of human stories where you kind of have to spend a little bit of time with people, you have to gain their trust to really understand their lives. I hope that's what I've contributed more here. You know, I'm thinking about stories right now that just took a long time to report, right? Like people who were dealing with long COVID before long COVID was really a thing. People who were sitting inside their homes after Hurricane Ida without electricity for 7 days, and their medical devices didn't have power, or they didn't have ice to refrigerate their medication. I think those are the kind of stories I hope that I've contributed.
Great. Those are great examples. Erica, the news deserts is a very powerful term and has really helped, I think, to convey, you know, just how severe things have gotten, because we kind of were used to like, oh, we went from 2 newspapers to 1. Okay, that doesn't sound good. But now we're in these situations where there's deserts, there's like gaps, there's nothing or very little. What do we know about where those are, and are there certain parts of the country that have been hit harder, or certain communities that have been hit harder, or is it very kind of particular to just what the history of the news was in that area?
Yeah, I mean, I think it has a lot to do with what the history of the news was in that area. I think there are some, you know, general trends related to, you know, what's the ownership structure of the local news in a particular community? Is it owned by, you know, local folks with great ideas? Is it are they owned by local folks without a lot of resources? Are they owned by a hedge fund? You know, and so I think that's a big part of it. And I think kind of the economic outlook of a community, I think is also a big part of it, both in urban and rural communities. You know, local news is more robust in areas, you know, that have economic growth and high income readers and viewers. And I think that's also true of news startups, right? They tend to cluster in areas that have economic opportunity. And so that creates, I think, creates and continues some inequities. You know, I think the term news deserts, as you mentioned, is extremely powerful. But I think what's even more important is to think about, you know, even in areas that might not be defined as a news desert by one person's definition, you know, the news outlets in those communities are probably still diminished, right? There's still been loss of jobs, loss of coverage. There are still coverage gaps, you know, and I think some of the coverage gaps are, you know, might be reflected in the kinds of beats that Report for America is seeding throughout the country. Things like just kind of like shoe leather, local government, local beat reporting, public health, education reporting, you know, and while in the meantime, things like crime kind of go over-reported. And I think a lot of what gets lost is what you might call connective tissue, right? Like it's stories that explain policy decisions, show their impact on a community, stories that help folks access resources that are available to them or that contextualize how big topics, right, like climate change or like COVID, impact their daily lives. Like those are the kinds of gaps that we're seeing, you know, both in terms of newspapers, and I think it's also important to note that we're also talking about local TV, we're talking about local radio, we're talking about ethnic media, we're talking about digital first startups and newsletters. I mean, the landscape is pretty broad. And I think we tend to focus on newspapers, and that because they're very important and they're the drivers of a lot of original reporting. But I think it's important to notice that the ecosystem in a community often involves quite a few different kinds of news outlets. I think, another thing to note is that, changing reader habits, changing viewer habits are a big part of this problem, right? Like there's the ownership structure, there's the economic prosperity. There's also, has the news outlet figured out a way to create local and accessible digital age news coverage that both meets the needs and the desires of a community. I think that we haven't quite cracked the code there, and that's why we really need to keep experimenting, to keep researching, to keep measuring, asking questions. I think there's promising work being done in this area, especially here in my home state of North Carolina, but there's so much more to discover.
Is it right that it's a bit worse in rural areas, or is that not? Is it spread out all?
I mean, I think if you're thinking about where newsrooms have been lost, I think rural areas is true. If you're thinking about maybe areas that have never been covered, like parts of cities, maybe they haven't lost coverage, but they remain news deserts, or they remain severely short on information.
Yeah, that's a good distinction. And we'll come back to the as we're trying to create a better local news system than's ever been before, what things about the golden age weren't all that golden. But Representative Novak, I'm really excited to talk to you because I think that the bill that you proposed is one of the most important things out there right now. Why don't we start with just kind of explaining to folks what this piece of legislation does. This is, by the way, Representative Novak has introduced an important bill in the Wisconsin state legislature to deal with some of these issues.
Yeah, I worked in conjunction with Wisconsin Newspaper Association. I'm kind of their legislator on the ground. And what we did was I mentioned, I think you alluded to it before, Steve, there was some movement in Washington to do a tax credit for newspapers. Kind of where we're watching that, and we could see it faltering and stuff. So I rolled out a bill, Assembly Bill 762 for geeks who want to know the number. What it does is it establishes a credit, tax credit for small businesses that purchase advertising in local media outlets. And the credit would be capped at $5,000 and would sunset after 5 years. And we define qualifying advertising as in newspapers in Wisconsin, radio or TV, and internet-based sites. The business has to have $10 million or less of business a year and stuff. And what we were seeing, I came up with this and worked with Wisconsin Newspaper Association during the pandemic. It was hard, especially in rural areas. We had to shut down. The governor shut everything down. So my restaurants and everything was closed. And it affected the newspaper advertising tremendously in our rural areas. So this bill was to kind of get people back advertising in the newspapers. Right now, I am in my assembly district employment issue. People are looking and begging for workers. So, to advertise for workers and help. And so we got it. I was really surprised in a way that, like I said, in this kind of environment, some of my colleagues like the media, some don't, but I had a really nice bipartisan group of legislators sign on to this bill and support it. We had a hearing. Unfortunately, we didn't get able to have a hearing in the Senate or Assembly. Unfortunately, we didn't get able to move yet. I think what I'm going to do, we're going to be done in the legislature next week, or first part of March, is kind of what we do at this point is key it up for next session. So what I will do is roll this out right away again next session. But it did get a lot of buzz. We got a lot of publicity. So I got a lot of people talking. I had a lot of legislators ask me about it. So there was a lot of buzz created around it. And I believe we're the first state to take this on. And I've got inquiries from other legislators in other states that are very interested in this bill.
What was the thinking about focusing on the advertising piece of it, the small business tax credit, as opposed to some of the other elements of the national bill? Why did you think that was the best approach?
Well, small businesses, to me, they're the ones that are our lifeblood out here in rural America. And you lose one and it has a big effect on the community. And so that's where I was looking at. I mean, during the closure, I was really concerned about the rebound. So I want to get them geared back up and everything. So large businesses do, as we all know, large multi-billion-dollar companies have a different way of advertising stuff. I really wanted to gear it for your mom and pop shops, your little restaurant on the corner, places like that. You know, Dodgeville is the corporate headquarters of Land's End, which I'm not sure if you've heard of before. So I've got 8,000 to 10,000 people that work here today. Yeah, you're wearing it. 8,000 to 10,000 people. And Land's End has a whole different advertising aspect, so they would not use this credit. So I'm looking to keep my downtown businesses in my district and stuff like that.
Well, one of the other advantages of this approach is that whenever you get to talking about government support for the media, it's a volatile topic, but it's especially volatile if the idea is that the government is going to decide who's going to get the benefits. Because then you have, there's First Amendment issues. People would be concerned that the government could, as has happened, could use the purse strings to try to manipulate. There could be political favoritism. And part of what I think is so ingenious about this bill is it sidesteps that whole issue. It's empowering the businesses. The businesses decide who they think ought to get the subsidy through an advertising. I mean, they're going to do it on the basis, presumably, of what's going to be good for the business. But part of that, one would think, is the institutions that they have come to trust as, ways of reaching people in the community. So you mentioned that, it is the case in Washington. Well, certainly in the National Republican Party, antagonism to the media has become a very common thing. It's practically a plank in the platform now, focused on the national media for the most part. So what is your read about, the odds that this cause can be bipartisan? What do you say to your Republican colleagues who grumble about, I don't want to do anything, to help the media? What's your response to that?
It may surprise you, but I don't really get much of that. Yeah, the problem with the national media, and I hear from my colleagues on the other side, is we always laugh in Wisconsin that CNN and Fox, everybody should be stationed in Des Moines, Iowa. I'm in flyover area. I'm seriously flyover area, and I think the bubbles of the coast is where the national media is focused. And that's where they think their groupthink comes from. And it's very frustrating for both Republicans and Democrats in the Midwest. We're like, what are you talking about? This, Right. And so, I think it's not, I've discussed this with Democrats that I serve with, and we're all kind of on the same page. Wisconsin's a very, very purple state. I mean, extremely purple. Every election's decided by 10 to 20,000 votes. So, people are news junkies here, but they trust their local media. They don't trust their national media. And I would say that's across the board. So, that's why I think local media is so important. Sometimes we just sit and shake our heads what we see. So
that's really helpful. And that distinction, so it sounds like people really of both parties really make a big distinction in their minds between national and local. And in terms of trust, as Paul said at the outset, you do see these polls showing declining trust across the board. It's dropped even more quickly among Republicans, but it's been everywhere. And I wanted to segue on that to something, Emily, that you said, and maybe it was in an email you sent me, which is that for a lot of the people you talk to, you're the first reporter they've ever met. Could you elaborate on that, and why? What's the dynamic there? Is that like they meet you and they distrust you because you're in the media, or is it that by meeting you they develop a trust, you know, a new kind of trust or understanding? What is the dynamic there?
I think, you know, for the most part, people are always happy to talk to me. They want to have a conversation. They're not saying, oh, I won't talk to you, you're with the media. So, I mean, there are a couple different sort of reactions I get. One, if I say I'm with the Times-Picayune, you know, that's a big name in New Orleans. And so people are kind of like, oh, this is gonna get us somewhere. Like, we got to talk to her. Like, so there's that sense that local news can give people a piece of power for people who don't have a lot of other avenues and getting, you know, justice or attention for something that they feel has been, you know, that they've been wronged. You know, I'm thinking about even in people who are deeply distrustful. I was covering a vaccine mandate for hospital employees, and you know, walking up the steps of the Louisiana Supreme Court, and there's a group of, you know, a small group of protesters, and I'm like, I'll go talk to them. And they're all nurses, and they really wanted to talk to me. You know, they were almost like kind of trying to recruit me, but they, you know, they kept saying things like, oh, the mainstream media, and, you know, I kind of was like, well, you know, I'm the media, and, you know, I want what's best. You know, I don't have an agenda here. I just want to talk to you. And so, yeah, I think most people want to be heard, and really they want to be seen and reflected in the media. And I think a lot of times in national news, they don't feel that way. You know, you can tell when a reporter has walked down a street in a neighborhood and they can describe it really well. You can tell even when a reporter has taken the time to interview enough people to understand what it feels like to have a certain disease. You know, I'm a health reporter, so that's something I think about a lot. So I think, you know, people want to trust in news, and they want to interact with it, is my experience.
So it's not hopeless to win back trust if we have enough people out there doing it.
That is my hope.
You know, I use a metaphor sometimes that I want to kind of run by you and see if you think this is accurate, which is that the decline of local news has created vacuums, and the vacuums get filled. So it's not like when we say there's a news desert, that means there's no information. It's a different kind of information. It gets filled by other things. And there's certainly been academic studies about this that would indicate it gets filled by national news. So it's kind of part of the piece of the, you know, the nationalization of everything, of politics is part of this. It could get filled by social media. It gets filled by informal, you know, to talk neighbors and listservs and next door sites, and you know, some of which is accurate, some of which isn't. And I guess I wanted to probe a little bit about that. You know, what is filling the vacuums? Because at the beginning of the days of the internet, we kind of had this hope that, yeah, the traditional business models, the traditional newspapers, they may be going away or shrinking, but there's going to be all sorts of other good ways of getting information that'll be just as good. Maybe they'll be better. And I want to probe a little bit about whether that's turned out to be true, and just what is, when a vacuum emerges, what fills it? Does anyone want to tackle that?
I can tell you, you know, when you were saying that at the beginning about there's so much news now, I hear that from people all the time of like, I don't know what to believe anymore. So people feel that, especially when I'm talking to people maybe about misinformation, especially about COVID vaccines, they, you know, I try to educate people, right? And you know, but it's this weird line as a reporter, right? You're trying to listen, but you want to correct false information. So I tell sources, you know, well, most people would call that misinformation. Like, what do you have to say about that? And they feel like people are misinformed about who they are, that they don't, they don't feel like anyone knows them. So yeah, I think it's something reflected definitely in the average person.
How do you deal with misinformation? And I know even that's kind of a loaded term now, but when you see people repeating things that you just seem contrary to what you know the science to say.
Yeah, it was, I think, kind of when the vaccines first started coming out, it was, or even way before that, it was this something I think every health reporter had to grapple with, of like, wait a second, what's our role here? And but often it's these sensitive situations. I'm thinking about a person I was speaking to about her husband had passed away, and
from COVID, or
it was just a weird situation, and she felt she was repeating a lot of misinformation, and you don't want to, in that situation, say you're wrong. You want to say, I want to let you know that a lot of people feel that this is incorrect, and I'm a health reporter, I hear these things, and so yeah, it's an interesting line to walk, especially on an individual level. On a grander scale in my reporting, I try to just be very clear, which can sometimes be hard in medical reporting, and then to rely on experts who have an affiliation of a local place. So LSU, if a person is really into football, they're much more likely to trust someone who has an academic affiliation with the college sport that they watch on Saturdays versus a Columbia University or something like that. A very well-respected institution, they might not feel that way about that. So that's something to keep in mind.
That's interesting. Thank you. Erica, do you have a sense on this of what's filling the vacuums?
I mean, I think one thing is that we've kind of moved from an intentional consumption of news and information to a very passive consumption of news and information, where maybe you spent 20 minutes with your newspaper in the morning, or maybe you spent a half an hour watching the 6 o'clock news in kind of the old model. So you would seek out particular pieces of information, you would consume it, you'd be done. And that's been replaced with 24-hour cable news that's always on, or social media feeds where news and information is kind of separated out from its brand, and it is just kind of this constant thing where and so then what cuts through the noise and cuts through the attention, kind of the need for attention, is the most sensational, the most surprising, the most emotional headlines. And so I think that leads to this feeling of kind of always being exhausted by the news whilst remaining uninformed about things that are really important. And so I think it's it is this is the vacuum being filled with just everything, right? Where you've got your news next to your entertainment, next to your update from somebody you went to high school with, and so it's really hard for us to process that, and I think it leaves us tired and not as well informed as we were maybe when we spent a little bit less time reading the news, but in a more intentional way.
That's a great combination of feeling both exhausted by information overload and being less well informed. Representative Novak, what do you see in Wisconsin, either in your district or in general, on this? When it sounds like your district is maybe a little bit better situated than some others in terms of news desertness, but what's your sense of what the consequences are, or how the vacuums get filled?
Well, I deal with this some because I do live in Wisconsin, but people will call me or talk to me and say, why did you do X, Y, or Z, or vote for Y? I said I didn't. Well, they heard it somewhere or read it somewhere, and that's what I deal with a lot. So I have to prove to them, no, I didn't vote for this bill, or no, I didn't do this. And we're in this world now, where in Wisconsin, where if you're a Republican, you're 100% whatever, and Democrat 100%. And I'm all over the place as far as votes. I think the problem I see is people are getting fact and opinion mixed up. And they're reading the newspaper, they're listening to TV, and we all know, because we're in the field or been in the field, what's fact and opinion. And I think more so when people watch TV, they really truly can't separate a fact from an opinion, a news story from somebody's opinion, from an entertainment show, whether it's a news entertainment show or whatever. And I'm not bashing anybody, any station, but we all have seen it. And I think that's what concerns me.
Yeah.
Is the opinion and the facts are getting so mixed up and people are confused. And I don't think they're doing it on purpose. They just truly are confused. My people out here get their local news from their local papers because, as you said, we're fortunate, but they're getting national news. And that's why I said from the East and West Coast, which is kind of a bubble, and they're getting confused. I find that a lot. So, and as you guys probably don't understand, as I do, the rural areas, I think there's been a lot of stories on that lately, are really shifting. In the 8 years that I've been in the state assembly, the rural areas are really shifting to one side fast. And I think that's a lot of what we're seeing too, in the media. And I think the media has a piece to play, or I dig into that, I guess is what I'm trying to say, if that makes sense. So.
Thank you. We got a lot of questions coming in, so I'm going to actually start integrating some of them into the conversations. One question kind of relates to what we were talking about of what fills the vacuum, has to do with blogs and just kind of individuals that are trying to, that are writing about local situations. So, there's also this kind of website that has been called pink slime websites, which are not so much a local individual trying to do something, but a company setting up, hundreds or actually thousands at this point of local sites. What are we seeing right now? Well, I'll start with Erica in terms of this sort of startup world of, walk us through, what's working, what's distressing, what's encouraging.
Yeah, so I think the startup journalism world is very diverse right now. There's a lot going on in a lot of different areas, and so there are lessons to be taken, kind of both good and bad. I would say kind of one of the exciting things is that there's just there's not a very large barrier to entry, right? You can start a newsletter, you can start a website without a ton of investment, right? And so there's there's a lot of experimenting happening right now. On the flip side of that, there are certain startups that do attract a ton of money and investment and a ton of attention, while other folks are kind of like, kind of toiling in anonymity to an extent, right? So I think there's some unequalness to who's getting the investment. I think traditionally it's been a lot of, kind of the big players, the people who always get investment in their businesses. And so I think that is something that is maybe starting to change a little bit, but that's an issue. I think there's a lot of success being seen right now in newsletters. Like you would talk about Substack, but there's also, just kind of like people, using the newsletter, the email newsletter as kind of that way to be more intentional, right? Like that intentional, I finished it, daily news report. There's a great example in Charlotte called the Charlotte Ledger, which is Charlotte, North Carolina, which is a daily newsletter that goes out to folks covering education, business news, with a, kind of aimed at people who are, older than millennial and probably younger than your traditional.
Does it have original reporting in it, or is
it does? It's entirely original reporting. That's what makes it a little bit unique. run by a couple of my former colleagues at the Charlotte Observer, but their work is really distinctive and really interesting. Charlotte, North Carolina actually is just a fascinating news ecosystem because there's Axios Charlotte, which started as a bootstrapped daily newsletter that was very focused on food, entertainment, how do you spend your day. They've found a lot of success in job postings, right? Like, and creating this like very hub of where to, if you want a job in Charlotte, you go there. Was bought by Axios Local about a year ago and has moved in. So that's a fascinating thing happening in Charlotte. Then you have orgs like Q City Metro, which is a digital startup aimed at the Black professionals in Charlotte. You've got the traditional ethnic media, La Noticia. You've got an up and coming public radio station, WFAE, which has added tremendous numbers of reporters and expertise to their lineup. And you can almost kind of look at what's working and what's not working in startups by looking at this one city. It's really fascinating. I think that we did a research project with Lion, local independent online news publishers, and Google News Initiative last year called Project Oasis, where we surveyed a lot of digital startup founders about their business model, about what was working and what wasn't working for them. And a few of the really big takeaways about the journalism startups included in that study were that, number one, they were very much clustered in kind of urban areas. They weren't in what you would traditionally call a news desert, again, for some of those economic reasons we discussed. And that too, that there was not that very few of them had someone on their staff who was focused on the business of running the news organization. And as someone who has run a nonprofit news organization, you go into it thinking it's going to be all investigative journalism and fighting for the truth, but a whole lot of it is paying the bills and figuring out payroll and kind of getting your operations to a competent level. And that's a big gap right now in the journalism startup area, because a lot of funders are interested in funding projects, right? If not a lot of them are interested in funding operations or kind of day-to-day expenses or full-time employees, and so that creates a situation where you don't have a lot of like operational resiliency. So I think those were the two really big takeaways from that report, was just where are these startups located, and how little business support they have, and how much training, support, coaching they need in order to grow those businesses.
Have you seen any of the so-called pink slime sites in either Louisiana or North Carolina?
They exist. I've definitely seen them, but mostly by clicking through when I read a report on pink slime sites, right? I don't run into them in my day-to-day life.
Well, let's, Emily, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I think, the thing that I think about is how few people understand how journalism works, and especially local journalism. I get questions, from friends and family, and even PR people, I think oftentimes don't really understand like the ethics that we have to create stories by. I know Report for America has this initiative to help young people understand, but I think, the general public isn't always able to distinguish between like something that lives up to journalistic standards and something that doesn't. So there's a knowledge gap there.
And part of what Emily is referring to is that in addition to the primary work that the Report for America corps members do, they also do a service project in high schools or middle schools or in the community where they're working on youth media and trying to teach that. Here's back to the questions. How big of a city or population does it have to be for a local paper to be important? Representative Novak, do you have an opinion on that?
I think they can be important in any city. I think that Smallest municipality I have that has a newspaper is 500 people. And the largest I have is 11,000 people. So I don't really think it makes a difference. If you've got a model that works, I think it makes that's the key. I think any area can support a newspaper, because you're not only encompassing the village or municipality, you're in the town, that kind of area, and you keep the news. If you keep the news local in a local rural community, they will come. Trust me. If you keep it straight about the school boards, city council, stuff like that, that is their source, and that's what they want. And so I think that's kind of why I'm a unique situation where I have so many weeklies that are surviving, is because that's what they stick to. They stay out of the national scene, and in a little bit of the state, but so that's a model that works well in rural Wisconsin, I will say, and it's a pretty successful model. But with that said, I still am concerned about consolidations. The old paper that I work for is an independent. The owners are almost 80 years old or 75 years old, and they're third or fourth generation. I don't know what's going to happen when they decide to sell or whatever. So that's my concern.
Yeah, I think I think the question of ownership is probably under discussed, as we in this realm. Half the daily newspaper circulation in America right now is owned by hedge funds. That's a big deal. That's a really consequential trend, and it's probably going to grow, and we really need to grapple with what the implications of that are. Interesting question from Nancy Wilson. The concept of news deserts is similar to the concept of food deserts. With food deserts, the corollary concept is food swamps, where there is food, it's just not healthy food. Are you looking at news swamps in the same way? The competitive presence of misinformation or disinformation. Anyone want to tackle that?
I mean, I'll jump in and say that I don't think we spent a lot of time talking about news swamps, but I think that is an apt term, and I think it does go back a little bit to what I was talking about earlier, and this kind of deluge of always on news, and how the quality of that can vary widely. And when I talk about news diet and being intentional with your news diet, I think I am also talking about a similar concept, right? Of being mindful of what news and information you feed yourself, and how you feel after you consume it, and how well armed you are to tackle your daily life and your community's needs after you consume that news. So I think it's an apt comparison in a lot of ways.
I would be interested, from Adam Kaplan, I would be interested to hear from the panel to what degree they see local media, as they face the present challenges of democracy, as having a responsibility to look for features and feature stories that specifically counter this division, seeking out issues of cohesion and actually actively promoting them. Does anyone want to tackle that one?
I mean, I would say that I'm a big fan of the Solutions Journalism Network, and their approach to news. I think that it can be, you don't want to hide from what's going on or go into your news coverage with a particular agenda, but I think framing, kind of doing rigorous reporting, not only on the solutions in your community, but also on potential solutions, I think is really important. And I do think that newsrooms that only focus on problems, right, or that only write about conflict and never write about joy or community ties or solutions to problems, they're not telling the whole story. And a huge and very important role of local media is to give a sense of place, to tell the story of a community in a particular time, and make sure that everyone in that community can see themselves and can kind of understand what their role is in that community story. And so I do think, from a, if you are trying to be intentional about the news you cover in a community, it includes all aspects of life.
Can we attribute from Michael Galeen, can we attribute the lack of trust in national media to bad faith actors?
I guess what's the definition of bad faith?
I think that's one where we can kind of go in any direction we want on that one.
I personally think the lack of trust at the national media has been coming for years, long before the current political climate we're in. And I could see that one coming, I think, a while ago, when they moved to, as I stated before, more of an opinion model to just your straight news. And I don't know when we can trace that back. Maybe Erica would know when that kind of model started happening. You look at the days of CNN in the old days, all you had was straight news. They were in every airport. It was what's happening in the world. This is what's going on. And I think when that model started changing, and I can't put my finger on it, this didn't happen overnight. When you say bad faith, this did not happen overnight. And like I still say that's part of the problem, is that people can't, now we're at a point where people can't differentiate between opinion and fact. And it's kind of scary to me on the national level. So,
well, I totally agree. I think people underestimate the damage that has been done by cable news going to, in its prime time, to an opinion format. It's still called cable news network. It's still called Fox News Channel. They still sit there and look like anchors, but they're opinion shows. And so it's not surprising that people are confused about what the difference between, fact and opinion is, or that they would come to think that journalists don't have much standards in the reporting, if that's what they see. Why do folks decry the bubbles of coastal national media and not recognize that local media can be just as insulated and bubbled as bigger sources? Is that true?
Well, since I'm the one that keeps throwing out the coasts, well, it depends on your definition of local media. I mean, I'm sitting here at my desk with all my local papers right now, and there is if you don't live in the Midwest or, on the coast, I mean, I know you guys where you guys are, but I guess it's kind of hard to explain. Local media can be biased. I've seen it as mayor and stuff, and in assembly, but I don't know. I will tell you, just it frustrates me, and I know the Capitol Press Corps very well, so I usually can holler at them. We will spend 8 hours in a day in the assembly session. 99% of everything we pass will be unanimous or bipartisan.
Really?
Guess what lead on days, there are days, not all the time, but guess what the lead story is on every news channel, on every paper the next day? The one bill that we may have spent 3 hours arguing over. Nothing else about anything we passed. So that's kind of from a perspective of a legislator. But if it bleeds, it leads. That's become more prevalent too, even in the local media. So, I hope that kind of gets somewhere.
Question about how important is or should philanthropy be in supporting local news?
I can take that one. I do think that philanthropy is going to currently has a really important role to play, and I think that role is going to continue. I think that philanthropy is not it, right? I think there's a quote out there like, what's the best way to make money in news? And it's all the ways. right? That in order to be a sustainable news organization, you need to have multiple streams of revenue. And if you are funded by philanthropy, you need to have multiple philanthropic streams as well. You know, I think that you know, one thing that probably does need to happen in terms of philanthropy and journalism is that kind of local community foundations and funders who are locally focused are you know, we want to get them interested in funding local journalism, right? I think it's not possible to expect that the big players in journalism philanthropy are going to be going into a lot of small communities and funding startups. And so, looking, you know, so I think some of the really exciting work that's being done in North Carolina is around kind of network building with kind of community foundations, connecting, you know, kind of ecosystem work where you're connecting people who are doing interesting projects with local funders. I think that's a critical part. And I think I saw that another part of that question was about impartiality and do funders end up driving the coverage when an organization is overly reliant on it. And I think that can be a concern, right? And that's why I advocate for multiple funding sources. You know, being too reliant on any one funding source can harm your independence. But I also think that there are lots of best practices related to philanthropic agreements where, you know, where you can protect the journalistic integrity of your organization.
Thank you. I'm going to throw this one to Emily. You've kind of started talking about this. If trust is the basis for success or failure with local news organizations, how do you regain that trust?
You know, I think it's just, again, about making people feel like you're there, that you know what happened because you saw it, that you understand the issues. You know, I've had situations, I'm having a conversation with someone and I can tell they just are like, when is this lady going to go away? Like every journalist has felt this way. But then you hit on the thing that makes them understand that you understand them. And so sometimes that's saying, oh, this was years ago, but I was in a different city and we were just talking and I was like, this is so painful. And then I said, oh, well, your local hospital, they have a Legionnaires outbreak. And he was just kind of like, oh yeah, they do. And that was just something that he cared about. And then he told me a lot more about his neighborhood. And then I wrote a whole story about it. So I think it's being super knowledgeable about who you cover.
So being there, so on one level, like the solution to this on some level is like incredibly simple, which is we need way more local reporters because then they can do what Emily is doing of having face-to-face interactions that can rebuild this kind of trust. And also that they have the time to develop a beat. You know, I think it's, having done both beat work and general assignment, obviously there's a role for general assignment, but part of what has happened as the newsrooms have gotten hollowed out is the person who used to be the health reporter is now the health reporter and the education reporter and the criminal justice reporter. And, you know, surprise, they're just not able to get as much knowledge or depth or source development as, you know, as they could otherwise. I want to throw one extra question of my own in here to Representative Novak. This is just totally selfish for my own needs, but since I've got you captive, you know, we work on the national legislation to try to do something parallel to what, you know, what you're doing on the local level. And it was actually very bipartisan in the House when it was first introduced. It was co-authored by a Republican from Washington State, from a rural area, who spoke very similarly to kind of the importance of local news in rural areas. But it you know, when it got to the Senate, it got sort of wrapped up in larger political partisan fights, including general antagonism to the press. So what would you say to Republican lawmakers in Washington about why they should be open to something like the bill that you're pushing or the Local Journalism Sustainability Act?
Well, you really want to get me in trouble. It depends. I will go back to what you said, the Washington Republican. There's a divide in each party between urban and rural. And I think you probably know, Steve, being as around as long as you have, well, I didn't mean that, but as being in industry and stuff, that there's a there's a different opinion in Republican rural legislators' minds about the media than the urban Republican legislators in both Congress and at the state level. I see that dealing with my colleagues in other states too. So
what's the difference?
I think what I'm going back to is I'm saying rural legislators, congressmen have local media that cover local issues, and they have a better connection, and they build established relationships. I was a relationship builder, and that's why I got as far as I did, because I built relationships with you. I knew my congressman, I knew my legislative delegation. They'd come into the paper, I'd interview them, I'd built a relationship. That relationships mean a lot. And sometimes I think politicians get in this thing where let's attack the media, and they don't want to reach out and try to say, I've had people that media's members that have disagreed with me or slammed me in the paper, which is fine. I invite them in, say, hey, so what did you perceive? This is why I did what I did. I understand why you do. And that it kind of helps understand the media. That's the problem. And it's hard for me because I come from a media background, so I get it. And I'm used to looking at both sides of every issues, but some people that don't come from media, they just think we all suck. That's across the United States and state legislators. And I will tell you, I know you said Republicans, but there are Democrats that I do not like the media too, trust me. And I hear it in my own state house. So it goes both sides.
You're right. Gosh, I think we're already out of time. That went fast. Is that true? Are we out of time, Paul?
We have one more minute or 2 more minutes. So if you want to get another question or two in and get some last comments, happy to hear those.
I'll do one last question here from Sarah Vasella. What are some solutions that regular news consumers can do to support or revitalize local news in their communities? I'm going to give one answer to that myself. In addition to subscribe to a local newspaper, that's probably the most important thing to do. There is now also a world of nonprofit organizations that are trying to fill some of these gaps. And Report for America, plug for that. We place people all over the country, including in small areas, but there's all sorts of other ones, some traditional public media, public radio, public TV, and all sorts of new ones. So I would look at both, certainly subscribe to the news organizations that you think are trustworthy. That's probably the single most important thing you could do. Anyone else have?
Yeah, I would like to add in that I think folks should really support student media and journalism education in their elementary, middle, and high schools. Yes.
That's my college newspaper.
That's right. I think, we talk a lot about media literacy. That's really important. But there are studies that show that if a student it works for their high school newspaper or news broadcast or whatever their high school is doing for student media, that they are more engaged civically for the rest of their lives, no matter what career they end up going in. And so and there's just such a fundamental thing. It's a very low cost solution to this media literacy problem to support student media in elementary, middle, and high schools.
Oh, that's fascinating. That's great to hear. Emily, I can't remember if you're still doing a service project. Do you still have?
Yeah, I have some connection to it, but the one that I was with, which does amazing work in New Orleans, is called JR NOLA. And it's really great to watch those kids develop a new sense. And then like they're also like great little sources. They tell you what's going on.
Who runs that?
It's an organization called JR NOLA. Yeah, you can find their work, and we've printed, our Alt Weekly has printed their work. They've been in national magazines.
And what were you doing there as a volunteer?
I was kind of just like helping them, and I remember being in this situation where you are like terrified to ask questions and terrified to, find a source, and you're like, wait, I just go talk to them. Like and so just kind of encouraging that and just being there when they needed me.
Great,
and there are places that might otherwise be news deserts where student journalists in high schools and colleges are breaking news and holding people accountable. I think that's that's critical work that's being done by the youngest folks in our society.
That's good. That's very encouraging. That's a great note to end on. Paul, back to you.
Yes, I hate to end the conversation. We've had a lot of people who joined us today, and I think we could have, continue on this conversation for a long time. But I think from our perspective, from the McCain Institute's perspective, this was a great kickoff for a conversation about, strengthening our democracy. One of the core elements that our founding fathers really focused on was a free media. And all of you have, spoken to the importance of media in our communities. So thank you, Representative Novak, for this a very local perspective. I think, being on a coastal city, I live in Washington, D.C., and, the Washington Post is a great newspaper, but sometimes you just focus on the national issues. You don't even focus on what's in your own backyard. So I think getting a perspective, as you say, from Midwestern perspective is extremely important. Erica, what you're doing at UNC's center there, is going to be, it can help all of us understand sort of the ecosystem of news deserts and how we can support local news is extremely important. And Emily, I don't say young people, I know you're younger than most of us on this screen, but I feel like you and all this whole panel has given, sort of, I don't just say hope, but that there is a future for local media and how important it is to get to know your communities, to build trust in our communities, and to look for those local journalists that all of you have done in your careers, to strengthen our own democracy. I mean, this is what this conversation is all about. So I want to thank all of you for taking time, and to all of our audience, thank you. I know we didn't get to all of your questions. We had a lot. We have, over 25 to 30 questions that we didn't get to. But we hope you stay tuned to our next round of events. Our next one will be on March 2nd. We'll be discussing with election officials from around the country, from Michigan, Arizona, Florida, to talk about what they face, going forward in a new round of elections, to talk about what's going on in our democracy. So thank you all for your participation. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.
Thank you.